The first gunshot echoed through the Montana wilderness like thunder, shattering the peaceful spring morning of 1878 and changing Jane Dawson's life forever. She ran from their modest cabin, the hem of her dress catching on brambles, her heart pounding wildly in her chest. By the time she reached her husband's body, sprawled in the dirt of their homestead, his blood had already soaked into the thirsty earth. 3 days later, she buried Thomas Dawson with her own hands, refusing help from the neighbors who lived miles away, just as she had refused to believe he was truly gone. Now, 1 month later, Jane stood at the crossroads 5 miles from her homestead, her wagon broken down, supplies scattered across the dusty road, and tears streaming down her face. The wooden wheel had splintered on a hidden rock, sending her tumbling. The flour sack had burst, mixing with the dirt. The last of her money had purchased those supplies, and without them, she wouldn't survive another week. At 25, Jane Dawson was a widow with nothing but a failing homestead and a broken heart. She knelt in the dirt, trying to salvage what little remained of the flour when the sound of hoofbeats made her look up. A lone rider appeared on the horizon, silhouetted against the vast Montana sky. As he drew closer, Jane hastily wiped at her tears, unwilling to appear weak before a stranger. In these parts, vulnerability could be dangerous. The rider slowed his horse, a magnificent chestnut stallion, and tipped his hat. "Madam," he said, his voice deep and gravelly, "seems like you've had some trouble." Jane straightened, clutching the ruined flour sack to her chest. "Nothing I can't handle," she said, even as her voice betrayed her with a slight tremor. The man swung down from his saddle, revealing broad shoulders and a face weathered by sun and wind. He wasn't handsome in the conventional sense, but there was something striking about his features' sharp cheekbones, a strong jaw partially hidden beneath a neatly trimmed beard, and eyes the color of a summer storm. He wore simple trail clothes, dusty from travel, and a gun belt that had clearly seen use. "Name's Quinn Ryder," he said, extending a calloused hand, "and begging your pardon, but it looks like you could use some assistance." Jane hesitated before taking his hand. "Jane Dawson." "And I don't make a habit of accepting help from strangers, Mr. Ryder." Quinn's lips quirked in a small smile. "Out here, Mrs. Dawson, strangers are just folks you haven't met yet." He glanced at her wagon, assessing the damage. "That wheel won't get you home." "I can help fix it if you'll allow me." Jane studied him, trying to determine if he posed a threat, but something in his steady gaze reassured her. "I don't have money to pay you." "Never asked for any," Quinn replied simply, already moving toward the wagon. He examined the broken wheel, frowning slightly. "This'll take some work. You headed back home?" "Yes," Jane answered, reluctant to share too much information. Quinn nodded thoughtfully. "I can fix this enough to get you there, then do a proper job once we arrive." "I've got some tools in my saddlebags." Jane stiffened. "I didn't invite you to my home, Mr. Ryder." Quinn paused, regarding her carefully. "Madam, I mean no disrespect, but these supplies won't carry themselves. This wheel needs proper fixing, and you look like you haven't had a decent meal or rest in weeks." His voice softened. "I've been riding for a month. I'm just looking for honest work and a place to stay for a few days. I'm handy with repairs, good with horses, and I can hunt. After that, I'll be on my way." Jane weighed her options. She desperately needed help, but trusting a stranger was risky. Yet something about Quinn Ryder's straightforward manner suggested he was a man of his word. "3 days," she finally said. "You can stay 3 days, help me repair the wagon and the fence that needs mending, then you move on." Quinn nodded, satisfaction briefly crossing his features. "Deal." He extended his hand again, and this time Jane shook it firmly. Within an hour, Quinn had fashioned a temporary repair to the wheel using materials from his own supplies. He helped Jane gather what remained of her provisions, securing them in the wagon. As they worked side by side, Jane couldn't help but notice the efficient way he moved, the quiet competence in his hands. "You're heading west, away from town," Jane observed as they prepared to leave. "Most travelers are going the other direction." Quinn secured a rope around the repaired wheel. "I go where work takes me, been that way since the war." "You fought?" Jane asked, surprised by her own curiosity. Quinn's expression darkened momentarily. "Union cavalry, too young when I joined, too old when I left." He didn't elaborate further, and Jane didn't press. The journey back to her homestead was slow, the makeshift wheel forcing them to move cautiously. Quinn led his horse alongside the wagon, occasionally glancing at Jane with an expression she couldn't read. "You live out here alone?" He finally asked as they crested a hill overlooking her small cabin and the surrounding fields. Jane's grip tightened on the reins. "My husband died a month ago. Rustlers shot him when he confronted them about stealing our cattle." Quinn was silent for a long moment. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Dawson." "Thank you," Jane replied automatically, the words feeling hollow after weeks of hearing them from neighbors and townsfolk. As they approached the cabin, Jane felt a fresh wave of despair. The place looked more rundown than when she'd left that morning, the fence sagging in places, the small garden overtaken by weeds, the porch steps in need of repair. Thomas had always been the one to maintain their home, while she tended the garden and prepared their meals. Now everything fell to her alone. Quinn helped her down from the wagon, his hands strong and steady at her waist. For a brief moment, Jane felt the human contact she'd been missing, and it nearly broke her. She stepped away quickly, gesturing toward the barn. "You can put your horse there. There's a small room at the back of the cabin where you can sleep." Quinn nodded, leading his horse and the wagon toward the barn. Jane watched him for a moment before entering her home. Inside, the cabin was neat but sparse: a table with 2 chairs, a small stove, a bed covered with a quilt she'd made during their first winter together, and Thomas's rocking chair that she couldn't bear to sit in. Jane splashed water on her face from the basin, trying to collect herself. Having a stranger in her home felt invasive, yet the thought of having help, even temporarily, brought a relief she hadn't anticipated. When Quinn entered sometime later, he'd removed his hat and coat, revealing dark hair that curled slightly at the nape of his neck. He carried a brace of rabbits. "Caught these near the creek," he explained. "Thought you might be hungry." Jane stared at the rabbits, realizing she hadn't eaten properly in days. "Thank you," she said softly. "I'll prepare them." As Jane skinned and cleaned the rabbits, Quinn moved around the cabin, assessing what needed repair. "Your roof has some weak spots," he noted, "and the chimney needs attention before winter." Jane continued working, not looking up. "Winter is months away, and you'll be gone in 3 days." Quinn paused, studying her. "Yes, madam," he finally said. 3 days." They ate in relative silence that evening, the rabbit stew filling the cabin with a savory aroma that reminded Jane of better times. Quinn ate with the quiet appreciation of a man accustomed to trail food, thanking her for the meal. "Tomorrow I'll fix that wheel properly and start on the fence," he said as he helped clear the dishes. "Saw some cattle missing from your south pasture." Jane's hands stilled. "The rustlers took most of our herd. What's left keeps wandering off through the broken fence." Quinn's expression hardened. "I'll round them up after I fix the fence. You have a rifle, my husband's," Jane confirmed, "and I know how to use it." Something that might have been approval flickered in Quinn's eyes. "Good, you should keep it close. Those rustlers might come back." The thought sent a chill through Jane. "They took what they wanted. There's nothing left worth stealing." Quinn's gaze was steady. "There's you, Mrs. Dawson." Jane swallowed hard, the reality of her vulnerability suddenly stark. "I'll keep the rifle loaded," she said quietly. That night, lying in bed, Jane listened to the unfamiliar sounds of another person in her home, the creak of floorboards, the soft murmur as Quinn spoke soothingly to his horse outside. For the first time since Thomas died, she didn't feel entirely alone, and that realization brought both comfort and confusion. True to his word, Quinn rose before dawn and set to work. Jane woke to the sound of hammering and found him already repairing the wagon wheel, his sleeves rolled up to reveal muscular forearms. He nodded in greeting but didn't stop working. Throughout the day, Jane tended her neglected garden while keeping an eye on Quinn. He moved from task to task with tireless energy, fixing the wheel, mending the fence, repairing the porch steps. By mid-afternoon, he disappeared on horseback, returning an hour later driving 4 cattle before him. "Found them 2 miles south," he explained, dismounting. "There are tracks from other riders, your rustlers, I'd guess." Jane's heart raced. "Recent tracks," Quinn shook his head. "Few weeks old, but I'll check again tomorrow, make sure they're not coming back." That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the Montana sky in vivid oranges and purples, Jane found herself relaxing in Quinn's presence. He wasn't one for idle conversation, but when he did speak, his words were thoughtful and direct. "You have good land here," he observed. "Rich soil, plenty of water. With work, it could be profitable." Jane sighed. "Thomas had big dreams for this place. We came from Pennsylvania 5 years ago thinking we'd build something lasting." She stared at her hands. "Now I'm just trying to survive until I can sell it." Quinn turned to look at her. "Sell it? Where will you go?" "Back east, to my sister in Chicago." The words sounded hollow even to her own ears. The truth was, Jane had nowhere else to go, but she couldn't manage the homestead alone. Quinn was quiet for a long moment. "Seems a shame to give up what you and your husband built." Jane felt a flare of anger. "What choice do I have? I can't run this place by myself. I can barely keep food on the table." "You managed to survive a month on your own," Quinn pointed out. "That's no small feat." Jane looked away. "Surviving isn't living, Mr. Ryder." Quinn didn't respond immediately. When he did, his voice was softer than she'd heard it before. "No, it isn't, but sometimes surviving is all we can do until living becomes possible again." The words struck Jane deeply, carrying the weight of personal experience. She wondered what losses Quinn Ryder had endured to speak with such understanding. On the second day, Quinn continued his repairs while Jane tended to household chores. She found herself watching him more than she should, noticing the way the sun had bronzed his skin, how his eyes crinkled slightly at the corners when he was concentrating. Once, he caught her looking and held her gaze for a moment before she turned away, her cheeks warming. That afternoon, storm clouds gathered on the horizon. Quinn worked faster, trying to finish the fence before the rain came. Jane brought him water, watching as he drank deeply, a trickle escaping down his beard-stubbled chin. "Thank you," he said, handing back the cup, his fingers brushing hers. "Should be done before the storm hits." But the Montana weather was unpredictable. Within half an hour, the sky darkened dramatically, and rain began to fall in heavy sheets. Jane called for Quinn to come inside, watching from the doorway as he gathered his tools and ran toward the cabin, already soaked. Inside, water dripped from his hair and clothes onto the wooden floor. Jane handed him a towel. "You'll catch your death," she scolded, then froze, realizing she'd spoken to him as she might have to Thomas. If Quinn noticed, he didn't show it. He dried his face and hair, then moved to stand by the stove for warmth. "Roof's holding," he observed. "That's good." Jane busied herself preparing dinner, aware of Quinn changing into dry clothes in the back room. When he emerged, wearing a clean shirt that stretched across his broad shoulders, she felt a peculiar flutter in her stomach that she quickly suppressed. The storm intensified as evening fell, wind howling around the cabin's corners and rain pounding on the roof. They ate by lamplight, the storm creating a strange intimacy as they sat across from each other at the small table. "Tell me about Pennsylvania," Quinn said unexpectedly. "What was your life like before coming west?" Jane was surprised by his interest but found herself answering. "I grew up in a small town near Pittsburgh. My father was a blacksmith. I helped my mother with the younger children. I have 3 sisters and 2 brothers." "Big family," Quinn commented. "How did you meet your husband?" Jane smiled slightly at the memory. "Thomas came to my father's shop. He was passing through, working as a surveyor, said he fell in love with me at first sight, though I didn't believe him then." She twisted her wedding ring absently. "We married 6 months later against my parents' wishes. They thought he was too restless, too full of dreams." And were they right? Jane considered the question. About the dreams, yes, Thomas always wanted more land, more cattle, more of everything, but he wasn't restless, not with me. He was dedicated to building our future. She blinked back unexpected tears. He was a good man, Quinn nodded, his expression solemn. Sounds like he was. What about you? Jane asked, redirecting the conversation. Do you have family somewhere? A shadow passed over Quinn's face. Had a brother, lost him at Gettysburg. Parents passed before the war, been on my own since. I'm sorry, Jane said softly. Quinn shrugged. It was a long time ago. But his eyes told a different story. Later, as Jane prepared for bed, the storm reached its peak. Wind rattled the windows, and a particularly loud crack of thunder made her jump. Then came another sound, not thunder, but something striking the roof. Quinn appeared in the doorway, alert. Tree branch, he said. Stay here. He grabbed his coat and headed outside before Jane could protest. She stood anxiously by the window, trying to see through the rain. Minutes later, Quinn returned, drenched again but satisfied. Cleared it off, no damage to the roof. You didn't have to do that, Jane said, handing him another towel. Quinn accepted it with a nod. Couldn't let your roof get damaged after telling you it was sound. Jane felt a rush of gratitude that went beyond the immediate help. For weeks, she'd carried every burden alone, made every decision, faced every problem with no one to turn to. Having someone else take responsibility, even for something small, was an unexpected relief. Thank you, she said, meaning it for more than just the roof. Quinn seemed to understand. He reached out, hesitated, then gently touched her shoulder. Get some rest, Jane. Everything's secure. It was the first time he'd used her given name, and the sound of it in his deep voice stirred something inside her that she thought had died with Thomas. The storm passed during the night, and dawn broke clear and fresh. Jane woke to the smell of coffee and found Quinn already up, tending the stove. He'd prepared a simple breakfast of biscuits and the last of the rabbit stew. Hope you don't mind, he said when he saw her. Thought you could use the rest. Jane shook her head, touched by the consideration. No, thank you. I haven't slept that well in a while. They ate together, and Jane found herself dreading the day's end when Quinn would leave as agreed. He seemed to be thinking the same thing, his expression thoughtful as he glanced around the cabin. I could stay another day or two, he offered casually. That storm set us back. Still need to finish the fence and check for more strays. Jane hesitated. The practical part of her knew she needed the help, but another part, the part that had noticed the warmth of Quinn's eyes and the strength of his hands, was wary of allowing him to stay longer. The feeling stirring inside her felt like a betrayal of Thomas's memory. I wouldn't want to keep you from your travels, she said finally. Quinn set down his coffee cup. I've got nowhere pressing to be, he met her eyes, and you still need help whether you want to admit it or not. Jane couldn't argue with that. 2 more days, she conceded. But I insist on paying you somehow. We'll figure something out, Quinn said, rising to begin the day's work. The next 2 days fell into a comfortable rhythm. They worked separately during the day, Quinn continuing repairs around the property, Jane tending to household matters, but came together for meals and in the evenings. Jane found herself looking forward to their conversations, discovering that beneath Quinn's quiet exterior was a thoughtful mind and unexpected kindness. She learned he'd traveled extensively since the war, working cattle drives in Texas, mining in Colorado, and even spending time with a Crow tribe in Wyoming who'd taught him tracking and hunting. In turn, she told him more about her life with Thomas, their struggles and triumphs in building the homestead. On what was supposed to be Quinn's last evening, they sat on the porch as twilight descended. The air was cool but pleasant, filled with the sounds of crickets and distant coyotes. Place looks better, Quinn observed, surveying their work. The fence was repaired, the porch mended, the cattle secured in the pasture. He'd even fixed the leak in the roof and chopped enough firewood to last weeks. It does, Jane agreed. I don't know how to thank you properly. Quinn turned to look at her, his expression serious. You don't owe me anything, Jane. The way he said her name made her heart quicken. She looked away, uncomfortable with her reaction. Nevertheless, you've done more than our agreement. Quinn was quiet for a moment. I've been thinking, he finally said. About your situation here. Jane tensed, unsure where he was going with this. You need help running this place, not just repairs but with the cattle, the crops, protection. Quinn's voice remained steady. I need somewhere to stay for a while, honest work to do. Jane stared at him, understanding dawning. Are you proposing to work for me? Quinn nodded. For room and board, plus a small share of whatever profit we make. I can help you build this place up, make it what your husband envisioned. He held her gaze. No strings attached. When you decide to sell, or when you don't need my help anymore, I'll move on. Jane's mind raced. The offer made practical sense. She desperately needed help, and Quinn had proven himself capable and trustworthy. But having him stay indefinitely, living in such close quarters. I need to think about it, she said finally. Quinn nodded, unsurprised. Of course, I'll head out in the morning as agreed unless you decide otherwise. That night, Jane lay awake, weighing her options. Having Quinn stay would certainly improve her chances of saving the homestead, but there was more to consider. In just a few days, he'd awakened feelings she thought were buried with Thomas, not just attraction, but a sense of possibility, of a future beyond mere survival. Was she betraying Thomas by considering it? Or would he have wanted her to do whatever was necessary to preserve what they'd built together? And what about Quinn's motives? He seemed sincere, but men didn't usually offer help without expecting something in return. Morning came with no clear answer. Jane found Quinn by the barn, saddling his horse, preparing to leave as promised. He looked up as she approached, his expression carefully neutral. I've been thinking about your offer, Jane said, her voice steadier than she felt. Quinn paused, waiting. I can't pay much, she continued. And it would be temporary, just until I get the place running properly again. A slow smile spread across Quinn's face. Is that a yes? Jane nodded. Yes, but we need to be clear about arrangements. You'll continue to stay in the back room and we'll set proper terms for your share of any profits. Agreed, Quinn said, extending his hand. Jane took it, feeling the warmth and strength of his grip. I should warn you, she added, I'm not an easy person to work for. I'm stubborn and set in my ways. Quinn's smile widened. I wouldn't expect anything less, Mrs. Dawson. The weeks that followed established a new normal. Quinn rose before dawn each day, tending to the cattle and property while Jane managed the household and garden. They expanded the vegetable plot, and Quinn hunted regularly, ensuring they had meat. He even traded labor with a neighboring farmer for 2 milk cows, giving Jane a means to make butter and cheese. The arrangement was primarily practical. But as days turned to weeks, something else grew between them, a partnership based on mutual respect and growing affection. Jane found herself looking forward to their evening conversations, to sharing meals, to the small moments when their hands might brush as they worked side by side. One evening in late June, nearly 2 months after Quinn had first found Jane on the road, they sat on the porch watching a spectacular sunset. The homestead looked transformed, fences mended, garden thriving, cattle healthy in the pasture. Thomas would be proud of what you've accomplished, Quinn said quietly. Jane turned to him, surprised. What we've accomplished, she corrected. I couldn't have done this without you. Quinn shook his head. You're stronger than you give yourself credit for. You would have found a way. Jane considered his words. Perhaps, but it would have been a much harder road. She paused. I'm grateful you came along when you did. Quinn's gaze held hers. So am I. Something in his voice made Jane's heart beat faster. Over the past weeks, she'd become increasingly aware of Quinn as more than just a hired hand, the way his shirt clung to his shoulders when damp with sweat. How his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the gentleness in his hands when he tended to an injured calf. Quinn, she began, not sure what she wanted to say. A distant sound interrupted her hoofbeats approaching at speed. Quinn was on his feet instantly, hand moving to his gun. Get inside, he said, his voice hard. Jane stood but didn't move toward the door. No, this is my home, I won't hide. Quinn gave her a quick, approving glance. "Get your rifle, then." Jane hurried inside, returning moments later with Thomas's Winchester. By then, 3 riders had appeared at the edge of the property. Quinn stood on the porch steps, his stance relaxed but alert. The riders approached slowly, stopping a respectful distance from the cabin. Jane recognized the leader, William Mason, one of the largest ranchers in the area and a friend of Thomas. "Evening, Mrs. Dawson," Mason called. "Saw your place was looking better. Thought we'd check in on you." Quinn remained silent, letting Jane respond. "Thank you, Mr. Mason. As you can see, we're managing well." Mason's eyes shifted to Quinn, assessing. "So I see. Don't believe I've had the pleasure." "Quinn Ryder," Quinn replied. "I work for Mrs. Dawson." Mason nodded, though his expression remained suspicious. "Been meaning to talk to you, Mrs. Dawson, about your husband's debts." Jane stiffened. "What debts?" "Thomas borrowed against this property last winter for cattle feed and supplies, $500 due next month." Jane felt the blood drain from her face. Thomas had never mentioned borrowing money. "I don't believe you," she said, though doubt crept into her voice. Mason reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. "Got the note right here with his signature." Quinn stepped forward. "May I see that?" Mason hesitated, then handed it over. Quinn examined it carefully, then passed it to Jane. The signature looked like Thomas's, but something felt wrong. "Even if this is legitimate," Quinn said. "What's your interest, Mason? Thomas owe you money directly?" Mason shook his head. "No, but I've purchased the note from the bank. As a favor to Mrs. Dawson, of course. Thought it might be easier to deal with me than with them." He smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I'd be willing to forget the debt entirely, in exchange for this property." Understanding dawned on Jane. "You want our land," Mason shrugged. "It adjoins mine, makes sense for me to acquire it, and you're alone now, Mrs. Dawson. How long do you think you can manage out here?" "She's not alone," Quinn said, his voice quiet but firm, "and we're doing just fine." Mason's gaze hardened as it shifted between them. "I see. Well, the offer stands, land for debt. Otherwise, payments due in full in 30 days. He tipped his hat. "Good evening, Mrs. Dawson, Mr. Ryder." The 3 riders turned and left as quickly as they'd come. Jane's hands trembled as she looked at the loan document. "I had no idea," she whispered. "Thomas never told me." Quinn took the paper, studying it more carefully. "Something's not right. Did your husband ever mention needing money?" Jane shook her head. "We were careful with our savings. And last winter wasn't particularly harsh. We had plenty of feed stored." She looked at Quinn, fear in her eyes. "What if it's a forgery?" "Possible," Quinn agreed, "but proving it would be difficult. And even if it is, Mason's got the law on his side with this document." Jane sank onto the porch steps, overwhelmed. Just when things were improving, just when she'd begun to believe she could keep the homestead, this new threat emerged. "We don't have $500, she said hopelessly. "We barely have 5. Quinn sat beside her, his shoulder touching hers. "We've got a month. We'll figure something out." Jane turned to look at him, struck by his use of we. Despite everything, a small warmth kindled inside her at the knowledge she wasn't facing this alone. Why would Mason go to such lengths for our land, she wondered. Quinn's expression was thoughtful. "Good question. This is nice property but not worth committing fraud. There must be something more." That night they sat at the table long after dinner discussing options. They could try to raise the money by selling cattle, but they didn't have enough to generate that sum. They could challenge the loan's legitimacy, but that would be difficult without proof. "There's something we're missing," Quinn insisted. "Mason's too determined." Jane suddenly remembered something Thomas had mentioned months before. "Water rights," she said. "Thomas was excited about the creek on our property, said it was valuable because it flows year-round, even in drought years." Quinn's eyes lit up with understanding. "That's it. Mason's ranch is west of here, if he controls this creek. He controls water for the whole valley," Jane finished. "Thomas must have refused to sell him water rights, so now he's trying another approach." They stayed up late, formulating a plan. The next morning, Quinn rode to town to investigate the loan further while Jane searched through Thomas's papers for anything relevant. When Quinn returned that evening, his expression was grim but determined. "The bank confirms the loan exists, but the clerk seemed nervous when I asked questions. And I found something else." He produced a newspaper. "There's gold being found 30 miles north of here, not a major strike but enough to bring prospectors." Jane frowned, confused. "What does that have to do with our situation?" "Prospectors need water," Quinn explained. "Lots of it. And reliable water becomes incredibly valuable." He spread a map on the table. "If someone controlled both this creek and the North Fork that runs through Mason's property, they'd have a monopoly on water for the whole mining operation," Jane finished, understanding dawning. "And could charge whatever they wanted." Quinn nodded. "Mason's trying to position himself, but he needs your land to complete his plan." Over the next 3 weeks, they worked frantically to counter Mason's scheme. Quinn rode to the county seat and discovered that Thomas had indeed filed paperwork securing their water rights that would transfer to whoever owned the property. He also found a surveyor who confirmed that their creek was one of the few reliable water sources in the area. Meanwhile, Jane wrote to her family in Pennsylvania, explaining her situation and asking for any financial help they could provide. It was a difficult letter to write, admitting she needed assistance, but her pride was worth less than losing everything she and Thomas had built. As the deadline approached, tension grew between Jane and Quinn not from conflict, but from the increasing awareness of what they meant to each other. Working side by side to save her home had created a bond deeper than employer and employee, deeper even than friendship. One evening, a week before the debt came due, Jane found Quinn by the creek, sitting on a rock and staring at the water. She sat beside him, their shoulders touching. "We've done everything we can," she said softly. "If my family can't help, we'll find another way," Quinn insisted. "I won't let you lose this place." Jane turned to look at him, struck by the determination in his voice. "Why is this so important to you, Quinn? You could have moved on weeks ago." Quinn was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and intense. "After the war, I wandered. Never staying anywhere long, never connecting with anyone or anything." He met her eyes. "Until I found you on that road, crying over a broken wheel and ruined flower." Jane's breath caught in her throat. "I wasn't looking to stay," Quinn continued, "but something about you, about this place." He gestured around them. "For the first time in years, I feel like I'm where I'm supposed to be." Jane felt tears well in her eyes. "I was so afraid after Thomas died, not just of failing, but of being alone forever, of never feeling anything again except grief and fear." She reached for his hand. "You changed that." Quinn's fingers interlaced with hers. "Jane," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I need you to know that whatever happens with Mason and this land, I'm not going anywhere unless you want me to." Jane's heart pounded. "I don't want you to go," she whispered. "Not ever." Quinn's free hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb gently wiping away a tear. Slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, he leaned forward and kissed her. It was gentle at first, tentative, but deepened as Jane responded. His arms encircled her, strong and protective as her hands gripped his shoulders. When they finally parted, both were breathing heavily. "I've wanted to do that for weeks," Quinn admitted, resting his forehead against hers. Jane smiled through her tears. "So have I." 3 days before Mason's deadline, a letter arrived from Jane's family. They'd scraped together $300, not enough to pay the debt in full, but a start. The same day, Quinn returned from town with news that several of Thomas's friends were willing to contribute small amounts, having heard about Mason's tactics. "We're still short," Jane calculated that evening, "by about $50. Quinn reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch. "This should cover the rest," he said, pouring gold coins onto the table. Jane stared at the money. "Where did you get this?" "Been saving it for years," Quinn explained. "Never had anything worth spending it on before." Jane shook her head. "I can't take your savings, you've already done so much." Quinn took her hands in his. Jane, listen to me, this isn't just your fight anymore, it's ours. He looked around the cabin, then back at her. I love this land because you love it, because it's part of you. The words hung between them, their meaning clear even though he hadn't explicitly said them. Jane felt her heart swell with emotion. Quinn, she began, but was interrupted by the sound of approaching riders. They hurried to the door. Mason had returned, this time with 5 men. Quinn's hand went to his gun, but Jane placed her hand over his. No, let's hear what he has to say first. Mason dismounted, approaching the porch with a confident stride. Evening, Mrs. Dawson, time's almost up. Have you made a decision about my offer? Jane lifted her chin. Yes, I have. I'll be paying the debt in full, Mr. Mason, all $500. Mason's smile faltered slightly. Is that so? And where would you get that kind of money? That's not your concern, Quinn interjected, standing protectively beside Jane. The debt will be paid at the bank as legally required. Mason's expression hardened. I think you're bluffing. He turned to his men. Search the house. Let's see this money they claim to have. Quinn stepped forward, his hand back on his gun. You're not entering this house without Mrs. Dawson's permission, and you have no legal right to search her property. The tension was palpable as the men stared each other down. Finally, Mason stepped back. Fine. Have the money at the bank by noon 3 days from now. If you're 1 minute late, this property becomes mine. He mounted his horse. And Ryder, I'd watch your back if I were you. These roads can be dangerous. After they left, Jane sagged against Quinn, the confrontation having drained her energy. What if he tries to stop us from reaching the bank? Quinn's arms tightened around her. We'll leave at dawn. Take the mountain trail instead of the main road. He won't expect that. True to their word, they departed before sunrise, taking the difficult mountain path that added miles but avoided the main road where Mason might have men waiting. They reached town without incident and entered the bank as it opened. The transaction was straightforward. Jane paid the full amount, received a receipt confirming the debt was satisfied, and had the bank manager witness the document. As they left the bank, they spotted Mason across the street, watching with barely concealed fury. Quinn guided Jane to her horse, keeping himself between her and Mason. Let's go home, he said quietly. They rode in silence for a while, relief washing over them as the town fell behind. When they reached the crossroads where Quinn had first found Jane, they stopped to rest the horses. We did it, Jane said, a smile spreading across her face. We saved the homestead. Quinn dismounted and helped her down, his hands lingering at her waist. You saved it, he corrected. I just helped. Jane shook her head, reaching up to touch his face. No, we did it together. She took a deep breath. Quinn, when you said this was our fight, did you mean that? His eyes held hers. I meant every word. Jane, I know it hasn't been long, and I know you're still grieving Thomas. But these past months with you. He paused, seeming to search for the right words. I never expected to find a home again or someone to care for. Then I saw you standing on this very road, trying so hard to be strong even while your heart was breaking. Jane felt tears well in her eyes. I was so lost that day, not just because of the wagon, but because I couldn't see any future for myself. And now, Quinn asked, his voice rough with emotion. Jane smiled through her tears. Now I can see it clearly, with you if you want that too. Quinn pulled her close. More than anything, he whispered before kissing her. The road back to the homestead seemed shorter somehow, filled with conversation about the future, their future. Quinn spoke of improvements to the property, of building the cattle herd, of making the house more comfortable. Jane shared her own dreams of children, of community, of turning the homestead into a true home. As they crested the final hill overlooking the cabin, they paused, taking in the view. The setting sun bathed everything in golden light, the repaired fences, the thriving garden, the cabin with smoke rising from the chimney where they'd left embers burning. It's beautiful, Jane said softly. Quinn's arm slipped around her waist. It is, and it's ours. The word held promise and commitment. Jane leaned into him, feeling for the first time since Thomas's death that she was exactly where she belonged. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. Mason might cause more trouble. The work was never ending, and building a life together would have its challenges, but they would face it all side by side. "Let's go home," she said, and they rode down the hill together, toward the future they would build. 1 year later, Jane stood at that same crossroads, waiting. This time there were no tears, no broken wagon, no desperation. She watched as Quinn rode toward her, returning from town with supplies and mail. As he drew closer, she waved, her wedding ring catching the sunlight. Quinn dismounted, gathering her in his arms and kissing her soundly. "Mrs. Ryder," he greeted her with a smile. "Couldn't wait at home," Jane laughed, placing his hand on her slightly rounded belly. "We got restless," she teased. Quinn's expression softened as he felt the evidence of their growing family. They walked hand in hand back toward their homestead, which had flourished under their joint care. Mason had eventually sold his ranch and moved on, unable to execute his water scheme without their property. The mining operations had indeed brought prosperity to the region, and their creek provided water at fair prices to those who needed it. As they walked, Jane glanced at the spot where Quinn had first found her. "Do you ever think about how different life would be if you'd taken another trail that day?" she asked. Quinn shook his head. "Never. I was always meant to find you." He squeezed her hand. "A widow stood at the road in tears, and a cowboy took the path to her. That wasn't chance, Jane. That was fate." Jane smiled up at him, filled with gratitude for the man who had helped her rebuild not just her home but her heart. "Then I'm thankful for fate," she said, "and for cowboys who know which path to take."